If life began in the waters of the world, it did not evolve into life as we know it until it had crawled forth from those waters onto land. That was eons ago, but somehow something inside us has not forgot. The human animal in its core harbors an impulse to return whence its progenitors emerged. Irresistibly, humans are drawn to water. And so it is that of all lands, littorals are the most prized, shorelines the most precious. And so it is that this stretch of coast in many minds is the dearest of the dear. This is Maine, America's coast. The sun, as it awakens our land each morning, plays favorites. It awakens first the coast of Maine. Now, whatever you have heard about the coast of Maine is true. And so is the opposite. This is a place of delicious contradictions. It is the classic rock-bound coast of Maine, but also they are the softly sanded shores of Maine. It is at times a crystal vista, air bracingly clear. But other times, this is the foggiest place in America. Pull a blanket of fog around you and hibernate. It was named the Maine, meaning the mainland, but it is off the mainland that lie its most distinctive features, the islands, the densest archipelago anywhere in our nation. It is a small state, but if you could unfold all the capes, points, peninsulas, bays, coves, estuaries, and fjords, the islands, islets, and inlets, the Maine coast, it is reckoned, would stretch 5,000 miles. It is the land of old salts. and young solstices. Playground and workplace. Vacation land, homeland, a place to see, a place to be. America's coast. Hello, I'm Jack Perkins, and if you hear me call this America's coast, do you wonder, what sort of hubris is that for a Mainer to make such a claim? How can this one stretch be called America's coast? Let me count the ways. First, by many reckonings, this stretch of coast is where America began. Indians hereabouts believed this was where everything began. According to legend among the Wabanaki, Glooskap, the man from nothing, the first human created by the Great Spirit, was created here. And this was Glooskap's messenger. The loon, in his eerie cry, was delivering Glooskap's message to his maker in the sky. So legend had it. And the fact is, the loon is the most ancient feathered resident of these parts, basically unchanged for 60 million years. That's the kind of history you find here. Look here. In few places on Earth does the past display itself as generously as along these coastal cliffs. Run your hands down the strata of rock and you are riffling the pages of history. Frozen in the geology of today are the prehistoric creatures whose shells, pulverized by pounding sea, became the sand of yesteryear beaches. And that sand, grit and spoil of an ancient epoch, was cemented into this, our past, locked in rock. Consider this. The first white men to visit this continent may have visited here. One historian believes these markings, still visible on the island of Manana off Monhegan, were made, for whatever reason, by Phoenicians, sailing here centuries before Christ. Now that is arguable, but this is more certain. European sailors had been coming to this coast since the time of the Vikings. That long ago? That's why some say this is where America began. Who says that? Well, John Gould, for one, Maine's best-loved and one of its most prolific writers. Gould recently assigned himself the role of unofficial, offbeat state historian.
The entire history of North America began in Maine. Nobody knows just when, but there was good reason why. Fish. The notion that piety and freedom to worship God nurtured our new world is poorly supported. Good state of Maine codfish, salted and in brine, was a staple in the markets of Europe well before any of the historically established explorers came looking for that elusive passage to Cathay.
Looking for that passage is precisely what the Italian explorer Verrazzano was doing when he found Maine in 1524. He wasn't the first European to see this coast, but he was the first to leave behind a written description of his seeing. The Isles of Casco Bay and offshore islands like Monhegan he thought were beautiful. But the people he encountered he described as rude and discourteous. On his map, he labeled Maine
Terra onde di mala gente,
land of the bad people. And as he was sailing away, he said,
the men on the shore made signs of scorn and shame that any brute creature would make, such as showing their buttocks and laughing.
In other words, it can be said of Giovanni de Verrazzano, he came, he saw, he got mooned. But again, before he or any of the other explorers got here, it was fishermen who found the Maine coast. As John Gould said, fish were the harvest that started America.
Off Sheepscot Bay, the chart of the state of Maine shows a group of islands called the Dammer's Coves. These islands were a rendezvous and fishery station for Europeans long before any historian discovered America. In the year 1620, which brought the Pilgrims to Plymouth, 32 English vessels loaded fish there, and each vessel made several voyages during the summer season. The Mayflower, which would otherwise have been in that fleet, forewent the late fall trip because she was chartered to fetch the Pilgrims.
And the Pilgrims, of course, were John Smith's come lately. As much as 13 years earlier, the first English settlement had been founded here, the Popham Colony, on the Kennebec River on the coast of Maine. If fish were the first harvest to entice Europeans, there soon were others. Trees. In few places but the Maine coast could be found anymore the tall, straight tree trunks needed for ship masts. So this was the pine tree state, long before it was a state. One of the earliest rancors between colonists and King George was over the broad arrow policy. The king's agents would go along the coast and emblazon all trees large enough to be useful with the mark of a broad arrow, which meant that no one could have them but the king. That helped spark what would become the flames of revolution. Another harvest important to the coast was granite, millions of tons of it, pried from island quarries and muscled aboard ships to construct grand edifices throughout our country and others. From Vinyl Haven in Penobscot Bay came the much-valued, fine-grained gray granite that would adorn New York's Penn Station and the Brooklyn Bridge. On Deer Isle, the rock bears a pinkish cast. You see it today along island roads, in seawalls and gardens. But far from here, you will find it also in the Washington Monument and Rockefeller Center. Most of Maine's quarries are spent now, but some still produce. There also used to be a seasonal harvest, the sort of harvest we might not think of today, for the crop was ice, sawn from coastal rivers, bedded in sawdust, and sailed all over the world. Refrigeration before refrigerators. And with all this shipping of Maine harvests around the world, it was natural that Maine would become the nation's first capital of shipbuilding and sea captains. At one point in the 1800s, more of the world's sea captains lived in Searsport, Maine, than anywhere else. Searsport. Still today it preserves the heritage, the grand old captains' homes set high on promontories from which the better to survey the seas that were their realm. By 1840, this new nation had only 7 millionaires, and 2 of those were sea captains from Thomaston. So this is how America began, and this is where. Even today, if you'd like to do some time traveling back to the past, travel the coast of Maine. Arrive as the great essayist E.B. White used to arrive when fleeing frantic New York for the solace of the Maine coast.
What happens to me when I cross the Piscataqua and plunge rapidly into Maine at a cost of 75 cents in tolls? I cannot describe it. I do not ordinarily spy a partridge in a pear tree or 3 French hens, but I do have the sensation of having received a gift from a true love.
60 years later, the sensation can be the same, but sights and problems differ. First place you come to, Kittery, Maine's oldest town, looks very new, wearing the face of quite modern commercialism. Beyond Kittery come the beaches. For tens of thousands of summer people, the names Wells, York, Ogunquit, Old Orchard, Kennebunk, and Kennebunk Port mean vacation. In the privacy of elaborate estate, or the distinct unprivacy of swarming sands. Old Orchard Beach is one of the broadest and smoothest on the Atlantic. This southern stretch is the most modern part of Maine's coast, with the most people, the most development, and the state's biggest city, big by Maine standards, if not by anyone else's. Portland is contemporary urban Maine, but it is Maine, and so its urbanness is distinctive. Commuters arrive for their daily bustle by ferry from suburbs with names like Great Chebeague Island and Peaks Island, suburbs that float on Casco Bay. Beyond Portland, the scenery changes. The coast begins to grow more vagrant. Fingers of land probing the sea, fingers of sea dividing the land. And as this mid-coast interleaves bay and peninsula, it blends old and new. Freeport, where old rubber-bottomed hunting boots created a legacy of fair play and integrity which has probably done as much for the reputation of this whole state as that of any particular merchandiser. It surely changed this little town, though not completely. When a burger chain wanted to establish a presence, it was required to do so Freeport style. So today, Big Macs in an antique house. In the town of Bath, old and new are different ways of doing the same thing. Boat building was the state's primary industry until the mid-1800s. This is how it was done, and how at the Maine Marine Museum's Wooden Boat Building School, it is still done. While across town, this is how it is done. The muscular shipyard of the Bath Iron Works, fabricating Aegis-class warships, where once full-rigged ships were prepared for the ways. Old and new, in special symbiosis on Maine's mid-coast. Wiscasset, self-proclaimed prettiest village in Maine. Among its sights, some unsightly wrecks. Booth Bay Harbor was and remains the favorite destination for many Maine visitors. Rockland, historic center of fishing, and with nearby Camden, home port for classic windjammers, which today sail with eager crews of novice sailors who sign on for 3 or 5 days to haul a sail, listen to the wind in the rigging, and sniff the tang of another time. Once, the principal thoroughfare along this coast was the sea. For coastal towns, being on that thoroughfare was their greatest asset. Today, though, the principal thoroughfares are roads and turnpikes well inland, and ironically, it is being away from those that is the coast's greatest asset. Inland, towns along highways feel the exploitation which reduces so much to the lowest common denominators of commerce. But coastal towns removed can still cling to old values, old ways. For most visitors driving Coastal Route 1, the destination is Mount Desert Island. Acadia National Park, host to more than 2 million visitors a year. And why not? This is a place with sights and feel like no other. This place reminds you what is sometimes said of Maine, that here is a place which God gives not to the lucky, but to the wise. Once they reach Mount Desert, most visitors to the coast of Maine go no farther down east. Down east it is called, though a map will tell you it is up. But again, it goes back to sailing days, when from Boston with prevailing winds the sail to Maine was downwind, down east. Here, the bays grow wider, are more open to ocean, with fewer harbors and smaller. Vegetation changes too, more subarctic. This is the land of blueberry barrens, not at all barren. This is the least populated part of the coast, with broad open stretches, utterly undeveloped. Where is the industry? In the hearts and sinews of those who inhabit Lubec, Eastport, Jonesport, Millbridge, Machias, Beals Island, who still build the boats and still take them out in seas that do not always forgive, and fog which alights sudden and thick, conditions some might think intolerable. But it is by tolerating the intolerable that the Downeaster earns his stripes. Life is more elemental here. This is the Maine coast of old, the lighthouse flashing its caution as it has done for so long. It was George Washington, just a year after becoming president, who authorized the first lighthouse at Portland Head, Maine, today perhaps America's most famous. There are some 60 lighthouses along the Maine coast. The light at Seguin, where the English settlers bound for Popham Colony first set foot on shore. Matinicus Rock, farthest offshore, where once the keeper's young daughter alone kept the lamps burning for a month while her father was stranded by weather on the mainland. Egg Rock in Frenchman's Bay. Nash Island Light. Pemaquid Point Light. Robinson Point on Isle of Ho, now site of a lovely inn. And this one, the light at West Quoddy Head. How delightfully down east, how typically perverse Maine, that the easternmost point in the United States is named West Quoddy Head. Lighthouses, flashing farewell to those who leave, welcoming those who return to America's coast. America's coast because it is where America began, and America's coast because over centuries it has inspired so much of America's arts and letters, so much of its creative genius. By population, this is a small state, so it is staggering to list all the great artists, writers, musicians who have either come from here or come to here for inspiration.
This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks.
Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Portland, Maine, America's first professional poet. That is, he not only made money, he got rich from his poetry, inspired by Maine.
Out of the bosom of the air, out of the cloud folds of her garments shaken over the woodlands brown and bare, over the harvest fields forsaken, silent and soft and slow, descends the snow.
Harriet Beecher Stowe was living in Brunswick when she wrote what some thought to be the book which caused the Civil War, Uncle Tom's Cabin. She also wrote, and eloquently, about her adopted state.
It seems to us quite wonderful that in all the ecstasies that have been lavished on American scenery, this beautiful state of Maine should have been so much neglected. For nothing is or can be more wildly, peculiarly beautiful, particularly the scenery of the seacoast. The sea, living, beautiful, and life-giving. Now it rises like a lake, gemmed with islands, and embosomed by rich swells of woodland. Now you catch a peep of it on your right hand, among tufts of oak and maple, and anon it spreads on your left to a majestic sheet of silver, among rocky shores hung with dark pines, hemlocks, and spruces. The people are simple-hearted, kindly, with a good deal of the genial broad-heartedness that characterizes their old father, the ocean.
Poet Edna St. Vincent Millay, from her hometown, Camden.
All I could see from where I stood was 3 long mountains in a wood. I turned and looked another way and saw 3 islands in a bay. So with my eyes I traced the line of the horizon thin and fine, straight around till I was come back to where I'd started from. And all I saw from where I stood was 3 long mountains and a wood.
It was on the Maine island of Appledore in the Isles of Shoals that poet Celia Thaxter wrote her greatest work, a simple description in prose of an island garden. That was at the turn of the century. The garden has since been restored, and her words and the illustrations of the great impressionist Childe Hassam republished.
Ever since I could remember anything, flowers have been like dear friends to me, comforters, inspirers, powers to uplift and to cheer. Often I hear people say, "How do you make your plants flourish like this?" as they admire the little flower patch I cultivate in the summer, or the window gardens that bloom for me in the winter. I can never make my plants blossom like this. What's your secret? And I answer with one word: love.
More scientific were the later writings of Rachel Carson, who, by warning us of the dangers of DDT, may have saved us from a silent spring. Her pokings along the Maine coast were as a marine biologist.
In this difficult world of the shore, life displays its enormous toughness and vitality by occupying almost every conceivable niche. Visibly, it carpets the intertidal rocks, or half hidden, it descends into fissures and crevices. It exists minutely as the film of bacteria that spreads over a rock surface or a wharf piling, as spheres of protozoa, small as pinpricks, sparkling at the surface of the sea, and as Lilliputian beings swimming through dark pools that lie between the grains of sand. The shore is an ancient world that keeps alive the sense of continuing creation and of the relentless drive of life.
Perhaps Maine's best-known author, until Stephen King, who, by the way, concocts all that horror well inland, away from the coast, was Sarah Orne Jewett, whose Country of the Pointed Firs was set in coastal Maine.
There was something about the coast town of Dunnet which made it seem more attractive than other maritime villages of eastern Maine. Perhaps it was the simple fact of acquaintance with that neighborhood which made it so attaching and gave such interest to the rocky shore and dark woods, and the few houses which seemed to be securely wedged and tree-nailed in among the ledges by the landing. These houses made the most of their seaward view, and there was a gaiety and determined floweriness in their bits of garden ground. The small, paned high windows in the peaks of their steep gables were like knowing eyes that watched the harbor and the far sea line beyond, or looked northward all along the shore and its background of spruces and balsam firs. When one really knows a village like this and its surroundings, it is like becoming acquainted with a single person. The process of falling in love at first sight is as final as it is swift in such a case, but the growth of true friendship may be a lifelong affair.
Often it has been islands which inspired artists. The poet Rachel Field lived on Sutton Island and wrote a simple, telling verse.
You won't know why, and you can't say when, such a change upon you came. But once you have slept on an island, you'll never be quite the same.
In 1905, artist Rockwell Kent brought palette and brushes to that Maine island on which many artists after him would also find inspiration.
Monhegan, its rock-bound shores, its towering headlands, the thundering surf with gleaming crests and emerald eddies, its forest and its flowering meadowlands, the village, quaint and picturesque, the fish houses, evoking in their dilapidation those sad thoughts on the passage of time and the transitoriness of all things human so dear to the artistic soul. And the people, those hardy fisher folk, those men garbed in their sea boots and their black or yellow oilskins, those horny-handed sons of toil. Shall I go on? No, that's enough. It was enough for me, enough for all my fellow artists, for all of us who sought material for art.
As it is today for Jamie Wyeth. It was Jamie Wyeth's father, Andrew, who made a home in the coastal town of Cushing one of the most famous houses in art, the house that was Christina's world. And there were luminist Fitzhugh Lane, who loved Penobscot Bay, abstractionist John Marin, who ranged the coast, and Thomas Cole and Frederick Church and their colleagues, whose enticing paintings of Mount Desert Island introduced the wealthy of Eastern society to that far-off haven, and so doing made Mount Desert one of the great resorts of the nation. And what was it that inspired all these artists and so many more? Maine author Kenneth Roberts passed along a theory that perhaps the crashing of the surf on seaweed releases iodine into the air, and perhaps it is that iodine which gives Maine's sea breeze its tang, and perhaps somehow stimulates creative juices. Maybe that, he speculated, is why such a small piece of America has produced so much of our art as has America's coast. America's coast for yet another reason, because it is to this coast that so many Americans sojourn each year. State of 1 million gets 8 million visitors. Why? Two reasons, different pronunciations of the same word. Some people come here for recreation, some for recreation. Recreation includes taking it easy or taking it a little harder. There are many ways on the Maine coast to recreate. For some, the finest, most contemplative recreation is simply to see what usually we cannot see or do not bother to see. The creatures with whom we share this place. Birds, especially birds, are precious here because so many abound. On Mount Desert Island alone, more than 300 species. And because, finally, they are so well cared for. Not like a few generations ago when the great blue heron, largest Maine bird tip to toe, was almost wiped out by seekers of plumes for women's hats. Or when eagles, largest wing to wing, almost succumbed to the ravages of the DDT, which Rachel Carson would warn us away from. Or when eider ducks, which molt all feathers at once, leaving them unable to fly for a while, were driven in huge flightless flocks to destruction in places like this, still called duck trap. So many birds were so wantonly destroyed over the years that when John James Audubon visited Maine to paint birds, he had to write home forlornly that birds are very, very few and far between. Today, on the other hand, when Acadia National Park each spring closes the Precipice Trail, one of its most popular, it is so that the once-lost peregrine falcon may nest and raise young on those cliffs undisturbed. That marks a monumental mind change. There is one more form of recreation along the Maine coast, and maybe the greatest of all. It's been going on for centuries. One of the earliest European visitors, James Rozier, sailing on board the little ship Archangel in 1605, wrote that for some reason in Maine he could eat and drink much more than he could anywhere else. Tourists have been testing the theory ever since. At the traditional seaside clam bake, or anywhere anyone is willing to lay a lobster on a plate. Lobster. To think that 150 years ago, people threw lobsters away, or fertilized gardens with them. Only the poor who could afford nothing else ate lobsters, and they hid the shells for shame someone would see. Similarly, fishing for lobster, which today is the state's most lucrative fishing, began with those who weren't strong enough to do real fishing. It's not for the puny anymore. On a sunny day, it may seem the ideal of independent soul set off at peace on the sea. But let a nor'easter blow or a thick of fog drop, and this ideal life and they who live it are as tough as a hard shell in July.
The salt, maybe? Yeah.
So much for recreation. The other reason to come to America's coast, we said, is for recreation. To remake oneself by studying and learning. What? Whatever.
I can put together his shirt. I can get
The heels want to be against the rock. That's it.
All sorts of learning on the coast of Maine. And that brings us to our last point, our last reason for calling this America's coast. Because it is here that America might learn some valuable lessons for tomorrow. We said before that geologists can see the past in this coastal rock. Well, the future is here too. These, what appear to be decorative splotches of color on otherwise drab stone, are the lichen which, seemingly harmless, will eventually tear this rock apart, pry it open to the ravage of water and ice, which will reduce it once more into soil, to wash away under seas, which we are told are rising again. So this coast one day will likely be underwater. That, we are told, is our probable geological future. But before that, of our immediate future, what does America's coast have to tell us? Because it was bypassed by most industrial expansion, Maine has kept more of its clean air, unsullied water, so that now, looking back, the rest of the nation increasingly values what it has lost, but the Maine coast still possesses. But there are changes happening here, and in them, in microcosm, we see something of the perils and promises we all face. Coastal lands, our most precious, are increasingly being purchased by the wealthy. Those of lesser means forced back from the shore. Gaps between rich and poor widened. Characters of communities changed. That must be recognized, especially as it's seen on Maine islands. Eagle Island had long been a family island, the Quinn family, but for a while fishing was bad and the family began selling off land to outsiders. Now those new homes seem to make the island look richer to mainland tax appraisers, so the Quinns find their own assessments up 80%. Big change. The problem at Frenchboro, isolated miles offshore, is that the young don't choose to stay. The population ages and declines. Frenchboro ran a national campaign offering land to homesteaders to keep the island going. Similar problem on Matinicus, but now and then a good sign. Not only will young Jennifer Rogers stay, so will school teacher Tom McKibben, her new husband. Adapting to changing economies, shifting social patterns. Every place has to do it, it's just a little more obvious here, and the dangers more apparent. The Maine coast fishing industry is in trouble. Trawlers bear electronic sensors from which fish cannot hide. So many fish have been taken that today it is thought there are fewer haddock, cod, and flounder swimming out there in the ocean than were being caught each year a decade ago. Have we forgotten the lesson of the plume hunters and eider harvesters of yore? That if you take it all today, there won't be any tomorrow? Lobstermen have done better, with both minimum and maximum size limits. With some regulation and much self-restraint, they seem not to be depleting their stocks. Further, some fishermen are learning new ways. Here on Swan's Island and in other places like Eastport, they are raising salmon and trout in seaborne pens. Aquaculture. Way of the future? This is sea urchins? Catching them on purpose? Yes, because of sushi and Japanese demand, these pests, once discarded, have become one of the most valuable segments of Maine fishing. Change with the times. Clamming has long been a muddy, burrowing, back-aching freelance business on the Maine coast. Now it is organized. A clam nursery in Jonesport. And mussels. Farming mussels. Seaweed tangles boat props, snares fish hooks, a bother, until someone makes a market. Suddenly, seaweed is a product. Adapt to change. Adopt the new. There are people on this coast who show the way. The Island Institute, which, as it studies, hopes to steady coastal life. The Seacoast Mission, whose sunbeam chugs in with gifts of clothing, companionship, scripture, whatever is wanted. College of the Atlantic, its researchers tracking and classifying whales. The Wildlife Refuge on Petit Manan, devoted to birds. All of these people convinced that we need each other. Which brings us to this coast's final lesson. Consider island dwellers. Legend would have it that here is fierce independence, stalwart self-reliance. That is what we need. That is not what we need. And that is not what is here. Live on an island in winter, when tempests tear at the soul and test your being. In such time, you don't want independence. You can't be self-reliant. No, in truth, islanders quickly learn to be interdependent and communally reliant. In other words, islanders on their small worlds know the sort of lives that we in our large world must learn. So, this coast teaches and offers recreation and recreation, and is where our country began. It borders the state of Maine, but this is America's coast.